All right, and Stephen K. Peeples here. I'm back with my former Capitol colleague, Steve Meyer, who prior to us working together at the Tower in the late 70s and early 80s was a Capitol rep in Florida and New York, and then nationally and at the Tower, and then later went to MCA Records. But I wanted to flash back a little bit on a story that's pretty famous that happened in the early 70s that relates to Bhaskar Menon, who was the chairman of the Capitol EMI group at the time in LA, and Grand Funk Railroad. So and their management, and there was a trip to Europe for a gig in London, right? So tell us the rest of the story, Steve.
Well, I was in New York at that time for Capitol. I was an album marketing and promotion specialist. And by the way, Capitol Records was the first major label that ever had people that did album promotion solely at radio for FM radio at the beginning. They were the first ones that did it. And I was really happy to be in my hometown. And I was at the Capitol office at that time. I don't know if it was the president of Capitol or who made the decision, but Capitol Records decided to have an East Coast presence. And we took major tenancy in a building, 1370 Avenue of the Americas, and to open up this presence on the East Coast. And in that building, Terry Knight was the manager and producer of Grand Funk Railroad. And he had an office that was half the floor. It was huge. And Grand Funk Railroad at that time was one of the biggest selling acts at Capitol Records without a hit single.
Right.
And Terry wasn't very happy about that. But he was really, really unhappy that the EMI had done almost nothing in England to support the group. And he was really, really getting aggravated daily about it. And he decided to do something about it. And what he was going to do was replicate what he had done in the United States. Now, for those people that don't remember or don't even know, Grand Funk Railroad sold out Shea Stadium. And in the course of doing that, Terry spent his own money and took out that famous Times Square billboard, the same one that John and Yoko had taken out saying war is over. And when he announced that he was going to play Shea Stadium, most of the rock critics and community laughed. They didn't think it was going to happen, and he sold it out. And it was a huge success, and it took their credibility here in the United States at radio up a big notch. So Terry decided he was going to take Grand Funk to England on his own money. And he phoned Mr. Menon, and he said, I am going to go to England. I am going to pay for Grand Funk Railroad to do everything. And I'm going to do my own posters, my own billboards, my own radio, and we're going to play Hyde Park. And I'm telling you this so you can alert EMI that I'm going to do this. They're going to play the park. And I want to show you the failings of the company. And Mr. Menon said, well, okay, I'll let them know. And we're off. Terry takes them over. He does everything he said he was going to do. Grand Funk played in Hyde Park. Oh, there were several acts on that bill. I think Humble Pie was on the same bill that day. But anyway, Grand Funk Railroad was all over the radio, the media, everywhere. And 100,000 people showed up to this event. And Terry waited about 3.5 months till after the event. And he really liked me, and he came by my office all the time or invited me to go into his office and dialogue. And I think the only reason he really took a liking to me at that time was because I was the only other one in the office that had long hair at that time. But he really liked confiding in me, and he liked what I had done in Florida with Grand Funk. And he said, I'm gonna have a meeting with Mr. Menon here at the office, and I'd like you to attend. And I said, well, I don't need to be in a meeting like that. I'm not a national guy. And he said, I want you in the meeting. and it's going to get pretty heavy. And I went, well, look, I really like working here, so I don't need to be in the meeting. He said, look, if anything happens, I'll hire you. He said, but I want to show you how bad EMI is. He said, you'll see what goes on in this meeting. So he had Mr. Menon come to the New York office, and we met in Terry's office, and he had a table that was, it was maybe 15 or 20 feet long. And he sat at one end, and Mr. Menon sat at the other end. And I sat on one of the sides. And Terry started the meeting, and in front of him, he had a stack of papers and folders at least a foot high. And he starts by saying to Mr. Menon, do you know what this is, Bhaskar? And Mr. Menon, very politely said no. And he said, this is all the media and everything that I did on Grand Funk Railroad's behalf before we played this concert. And he starts taking the folders and tossing them down to the table. Here's the radio, here's the TV, here's the billboards, here's everything I've done, every review, everything. And as he was doing this, his voice elevated to a pitch, and by the end of it, he was yelling. And he said, and after I did this, and after Grand Funk Railroad played Hyde Park, and after 100,000 people showed up, and it's now 3.5 months later, and EMI has sold only 10,000 records. It is inexcusable. And Mr. Menon, how do you explain it? And Bhaskar just sat there in his chair, pulled a cigarette out of his mouth, and said, well, Mr. Menon, I would assume 90,000 people did not like your group.
Well, Mr. Knight, yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, Mr. Knight. He said, I'm sorry, Mr. Knight. I don't think 90,000 people. And from that point on, the meeting did become constructive, but that was a hell of a comeback from Bhaskar.
Did Terry sit down and shut up after that, or what happened?
It was dead air for about a minute, and then he just nodded his head down and he said, "Let's get serious." He realized that Bhaskar had a very, it's a valid point. I mean, how do you argue that point? There was progress made. I went back to Florida about 6 months after that meeting, and I don't know whatever the results were with the UK success with Grand Funk. I just know what happened in the United States after that, and of course they became monstrous.
Well, you touched on this earlier, but Grand Funk was not a critic's favorite.
No, not at all.
And in the UK, the music scene seemed to be, the critics seemed to have more juice with the audiences, with their readers. And so my sense is that perhaps UK audiences bought into that kind of bias. Do you think that maybe the EMI folks there sensed that and acted accordingly, or did not act accordingly as they saw?
Well,
was it like an FU to Terry to say, okay, well, you're coming over here and you're going to do it, show us how to do it, and it didn't work for you. So
I think it was a function. I really don't know what went on internally at EMI at that time. In London, later when I did go national with Capitol and I worked in the Tower, I heard very similar complaints from American managers about EMI breaking their acts in England, etc. My own gut feeling is Grand Funk at that point had yet to have a hit single. They weren't making the kind of music. Most of their album cuts were very long, and they weren't making the kind of music that was accessible to mass appeal radio. Here in the United States, they were selling huge off of album airplay, but they didn't have a hit single. And their music was rooted in very basic rock and roll and American rock and roll. And I just don't know if it went over well with the English audience at that time. And obviously, when they played live, it didn't impact their sales that dramatically. I think it was more a function of them, Grand Funk, not receiving the critical acclaim from the critics there, as well as whatever airplay they were getting, they weren't reaching success. And I don't know if you can put it all on EMI at that point. After they broke here, huge. I didn't follow them, what was happening internationally, but after they had many hit singles here, I never heard anything about problems anywhere else in the world.
I'm Your Captain is probably my favorite Grand Funk song.
Yeah, that's called Closer to Home. Yeah,
Closer to Home, and close, right. I'm getting closer to my home, and that was like a really long, epic album track that was edited for a single.
Yes, it was. That became almost an anthem at when I was promoting radio in Florida. That became, I mean, a matter of fact, Album Radio was thrilled that it wasn't a hit single because they owned it. And that was really the track that, for me, at least when I was promoting them during my experience, that took them to another level where people were welcoming them with open arms to the new music. And that became, their basic, their classic track at that point. It was prior to them having a major hit single. And it sold a lot of, they were selling platinum without a hit single. And when I started in Florida, they and Glenn Campbell were the two biggest selling acts beside the Beatles.
Wow. Just for the record, the Hyde Park concert was July 3rd, 1971, and the support acts were Humble Pie and Heads, Hands, and Feet with Albert Lee.
Yeah, I did remember Humble Pie, but yeah. Yeah, but Grand Funk Railroad was the alleged headliner.
Why do you say alleged?
Well, I don't know how it was postured. I never said to Terry, "Is Grand Funk Railroad the headliner?" And I at that time, Humble Pie was getting a ton of exposure in England. Of course, they were an English band, but I don't know if they were the headliner or if Grand Funk Railroad was the headliner.
You remember what the audience response was compared to the two?
No, because all Terry said was 100,000 people plus showed, and this is what happened.
Gotcha.
And when Bhaskar said to Terry, it's obvious 90,000 people didn't like the group. Obviously it's a satirical comment, and it's also a comment that you'd have a hard time taking apart, because if the one thing I can say about we knew about England was that if you played live, all the bands that broke out of England that played live drew and sold, going all the way back to the Beatles, the Stones, all of the Who. When they played live, they sold records almost immediately.
Yeah.
So it was always tougher for an American band to crack that, especially later on in the 70s. But, at that time, their music, I think, was just not that appealing to the English audience. That's my own take on it.
Right.
Once they broke, I didn't follow them internationally, but once they broke, of course, they became multi-platinum. And
American critics weren't too fond of them either. They
no. In fact, when Terry booked Shea Stadium, the critics laughed about it.
Yeah.
And the first thing they said was, "Ha ha ha! They'll never sell it. They'll never sell it." And the second thing was, people said, "How are they going to sell 60,000 tickets when nobody knows their music?" well, they sold the 60,000 plus tickets, and I was there that night, and I want to tell you something. People were singing their songs, so they knew them, and I also kind of suspected that it was going to be a very successful date because of their album sales. Their album sales were pretty respectable for a group that had no hit single.
Well,
So,
how did the Shea gig affect their sales? Was there a spike after that?
oh yeah, absolutely. We spiked on several of their albums, if not all. I think at that time they had the first album, Grand Funk, and the second one, which was a red cover, and then the third album I think was Closer to Home, and I don't know if there was one after that. I don't remember if the live album. I think the live album came out after Shea, but you know they all spiked in sales. Whenever Grand Funk, by the way, they were another band that toured relentlessly. Terry was very smart about that as well. So he toured them relentlessly, and when they toured, every place they toured, they sold.
Right.
And of course, once they did have a hit single, then it was gargantuan, and they started breaking a top 40. I was very fortunate that in my market, people reacted. And we actually had I think their first top 40 hit was Foot Stompin' Music. It didn't go nationally, but I had great success with it in Florida. And of course, after that, I think there was another cut called Rock and Roll Soul. And of course, the doors opened with We're an American Band.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Yeah. The first album was On Time in '69, followed by Grand Funk in '69, and Closer to Home was '70.
Yep.
And then Survival was '71. So, and then E Pluribus Funk was 70.
Yeah, I think that was the one that the album looked like a coin.
Right. I remember that. Who did that cover? Do you remember?
No.
That was a classic from the era for sure.
And then when we came out with We're an American Band, our vice president of promotion, Al Corey, took out trade ads, and he had a photograph of the album cover with the disc coming out of the album, and he made the vinyl gold. So his trade ad was Grand Funk, We're an American Band, shipping gold. And back then, by the way, there weren't that many artists that were shipping gold.
No, that would be like 500,000 out the door pre-orders on
Correct.
Day.
Yep.
Shipping gold. Yeah, that was a big deal. There weren't too many that could pull that off.
No.
And
again, that was their first mass, I think a #1 record, but that was their first monster hit single at radio.
Gotcha. So you were at Capitol until when? And
until May of '83.
Okay, and then you went to MCA after that, right?
That is correct.
So what's the story in making the transition from Capitol to MCA? How did that come about?
Well, while I was in the tower from '76 to '83, and while I was there, I had received several job offers from competitive labels, none of which I entertained at all. Anything that was that was coming to me was basically in the same capacity, a little more money, and I just loved being at Capitol. The legacy of the label, and I had made my bones there, and I wanted to stay. But in '83, MCA was rebuilding the label, and the label was basically at that time really had almost rock bottomed out, and it was known in the industry that they were going to bring in new blood, and they hired somebody that they thought would be able to run the label and have tremendous magnetism for the community of music people, and that was Irving Azoff. He was going to be the head. And about 2 weeks before Irving came in, Jerry Sherrill, who was then the executive vice president at the label, he was also an ex-Warner Brothers guy. Jerry called me and said he wanted to meet me for lunch. and talk to me about a position there. And the reason that I took the meeting, even though I knew that they were in very, very bad shape at that time, was because I started looking ahead to the future of the industry. And I saw that Capitol was music and records and tape, and that was it. And Universal was a company that was a very well integrated entertainment company, from music, movies, film, books, tours, etc. And the opportunities there seem to be abound, and a ton of opportunity if you were successful. So I took the meeting, and he had done his due diligence on me, and he basically offered me the job. And they offered me a contract and 2 years, and they offered me a very hefty amount of money. And at that point in place and time, the money was so much that even if I failed in 2 years, I would have made more money than if I had stayed at Capitol for 5 years. So I said to him I was going to really consider it. I was going to talk to my wife. I came back to the tower. I talked to my boss, Bruce Wendell, and he went in and talked to the president at that time, a man named Jim Mazza, and they made me an offer. And the offer wasn't even in the ballpark what MCA had offered me. And financially, I had no choice at that point. I knew that if I wanted to really secure the best possible avenue for myself and my family's future, I had to go and take this job. I really also felt that at that point that they were in such bad shape that if I could just take all of my promotion experience from my 14 years at Capitol and just make one record a hit right off the bat, I was going to look good. And I wrestled with it for about 2 days, and discussions with my wife and Bruce Wendell, my ex-boss, and it came to the conclusion that I had to go. And that was it. I left.
Just as an aside, Jerry Sherrill was the VP of Creative Services at Electra Asylum, and he was my boss there when I was in PR.
Yeah, he was one of the good guys.
One of the good guys for sure.
Yeah, and that's why I took the meeting with him. I knew him, and I knew his reputation, and he was a sincere man, and that's why I really. He was the only person that I ever really had a meeting with about going to another label. Even though other labels had called me, I never took meetings with them. But because Jerry reached out to me and said he really wanted to have a meeting with me and explain things. And he explained very simply. He said, by the way, he said, there's going to be a new president in a week, and it's going to be Irving Azoff. And I said, yeah, I know. I've heard rumors. And, and Irving, of course, to those people at that time that knew Irving's reputation was not, a lot of people did not like Irving unless you worked for him or with him. Those people loved him. Don Henley's famous line about Irving, is, people say Irving's the devil, but he's my devil.
Right.
And yeah. And I found Irving created an incredibly free thinking. Irving came in and he said, look, guys, I don't know how to run a record label. I know how to get talent, but you guys are here. You're my brain trust. So go out and make hits. And he gave us all the tools that we needed. And in short term, I picked one of the records that I was given when I accepted the job. Jerry had given me a box of music to listen to. Most of it was horrific, bad deals that the previous president had made. But there was one song on one album. The minute I heard it, I said, I want to promote this. And that song was One Thing Leads to Another by the Fixx. And we pulled it. It came out and it became a monster hit, and it took their album platinum. That was my first hit at MCA.
Nice, nice. So after that, you had a certain amount of respect in the house there, right?
Yeah, in fact, on that record, we had a meeting about it because the manager from the Fixx came in. They were receiving very, very good MTV play, and they had very, very successful play on their first album, and had reached a certain level. I think between 100 and 200,000 album sales, and this was, I think, their second or third album. Not sure. It was called Reach the Beach, and when I made that statement, before I got there, let me qualify this. The previous administration had released a single from that album that was called Saved by Zero.
Yes.
And it was successful at album radio. It did nothing at top 40 radio. I didn't know that when I heard the record at home and I listened to it. But anyway, so when I expressed my opinion to Irving, I said, look, I have a top 10 record in my heart. I believe this cut is going to go. And he called a meeting with the manager of the Fixx. And he said to me, you really think it's a top 10 record? And I said, yes, I do. I honestly believe. And then Irving said to me, Stevie, you've committed. So you know, and then when I left the meeting, I said,
your ass is on the line now, buddy.
So, you know, but once it got on the radio, it did its magic, and it was a top 10 record.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I felt really good about it.
That was Reach the Beach, 1983. It was the group's second album.
Yeah, and it went platinum, by the way.
Yeah, yeah, that was a great record, and it sounded great on the radio, even the top 40 as well as AOR. It had
yeah, for me, it was a one listen record, and you know, as a catchphrase, I just said, there it is.
Leads to the other, you know.
Yep.
To another. One thing leads to another. Yeah, that's one of the aspects of the most famous and most recognizable and most memorable songs is a catchphrase that sticks. I can't get
it does. It does. And it's still, you still hear it. You still hear it on classic rock.
Right, right. Well, we got a couple of minutes left here. I wanted to talk a little bit about Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, because they were on the label at MCA when you were there. And tell me a little bit about your first encounter with Tom and what records you worked on with him.
Well, I worked on every record from when I first got there in '83. He was finishing an album. I don't remember the title, but it was the one. The video that went with that album was him driving like a futuristic car. I remember that, and it didn't have a hit single, but that album was kind of at its end run. So from '83 up until I left.
That would be long after dark, probably, right?
It was probably
82. That was his
82. Yeah, the single, there was a single from it. I think it was You Got Lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it was at the end of the life of the album. And so from that point on, I was involved, you know, with every album. And I don't remember the succession from that point until.
Let me just list them real fast. Hard Promises was 81, Long After Dark 82, Southern Accents was 85.
Okay, that's the first. Yeah, that was the first one that I was directly overseeing, and that is the album that had Don't Come Around Here No More on it.
Got it.
And I heard that record, which I believe Dave Stewart produced, and it just stuck, and I realized it was going to be, as much as I loved that track, and I liked the whole album, but that track to me just stood out as having real signature of differentiating Tom from a whole field of artists. I thought it was a major creative step for him. And I knew it would not be an easy record at top 40, but I believed in my heart that it was a great record. And I really wanted to go for it. And I did. And, the record changes tempo in the middle of it. And a lot of top 40 stations didn't get it. It wasn't just a sing-along melody record. It was an involved single. And I just believed in it, and I gave everything I had for it. I think we went top 40 with it. It didn't end up being a massive hit. However, the video for that song ended up being the video of the year on MTV. And the video really impacted the sales on the album as well.
I'm just looking here real quickly at Wikipedia, which is horrible, but background and writing. The original inspiration was a romantic encounter that producer David A. Stewart of Eurythmics had with Stevie Nicks of Fleetwood Mac. Don't come around here no more. So there's all kinds of rock and roll drama going on in the background there.
Oh, and not only that, but Tom and Stevie were extremely close. So
yes,
that's kind of I never knew that, but
not surprising.
Not surprising. And so from that point on, I was involved in all of them, and of course, his biggest success story ended up being in 89 or 90 with Full Moon Fever.
Right.
Free Falling, I Won't Back Down, Running Down a Dream, and multi-platinum. I would assume at this point it's probably his biggest selling album, except maybe a Greatest Hits, which I don't have the sales figures on, but Full Moon Fever went multi-platinum.
Right.
And of course, Free Falling was, I think, his biggest single ever. I think it went higher than I Won't Back Down. So that was a huge, and that, of course, that was a solo album, but everybody embraced it as the Heartbreakers anyway.
Right. Well, Steve, it's been great catching up with you and hearing some of the stories and filling in some of the blanks. So thanks for spending the time with us, and we'll get this up for our friends and family to enjoy in perpetuity.
You're most welcome, my friend, anytime.
All right. Have a great one. Talk to you soon.
You too, bud.